Chapter 1 Empty Crag. As the morning sun crested over the North Sea, Creed followed his mentor along the rugged coastline. Perilous cliffs stood unyielding against the relentless waves below, reducing each assault to nothing but mist and noise. And although the sea would have usually held his attention, Creed's gaze was fixed on the green patchwork of farms and fields, neatly divided by ancient stone fences and draped over the Scottish countryside like a quilt. His gaze still roving over the idyllic scenery, Creed spoke to his older partner and mentor, Patton Burgess. "I can't believe that after all the places we've been together, I've never been to the British Isles. What a beautiful place." "It is breathtaking," Patton agreed. "I've always thought if I had to live anywhere else, it would be here." There was something enchanting about this place, and Creed wanted to probe his mentor for information. But before he could ask, Patton brought the conversation back to the purpose for their journey across the ocean. "Creed, have you ever heard of anyone capturing a harpy?" Creed's brows furrowed. "No, not alive anyway. But I did meet a potion master in the volcanic city who offered to trade me some adamant ingots for a few drops of harpy venom." "Ah, I remember him as well. I suppose adamant isn't priceless after all. Do you know if your industrious potion master ever managed to make such a trade?" "No," Creed replied, waiting for his older partner to get to the point. "I've had the rare fortune of spending my life traveling the magical world." Patton began, his voice thoughtful. "I've seen wonders few could even dream of, and I have devoted myself to protecting this world and understanding its mysteries. After all this time, I'd wager there are few men who have had the opportunity to experience the things I have." "You're laying it on a little thick, even for you." Creed interrupted, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Perhaps, but allow me to clarify." Patton replied with a glint of humor. "I've heard of potions made with dragon tears, mermaid scales, and even ectoplasm pressed from the eyes of a lich, but never once have I heard of a potion made from a harpy. Not venom, not feathers, not a talon. Why do you think that is?" "Maybe harpy venom is useless," Creed offered. "I suspect not," Patton rebuffed. "Everything magical, or once magical, has had a connection to the source or the void. I assure you, my young knight, harpy venom is both useful and valuable. Furthermore, I've never heard of a harpy being captured, certainly not by a mortal. I doubt there's a mortal alive who has gotten a good look at one. Not only are they wickedly fast and deadly, but they also have a reputation for being more cantankerous and territorial than centaurs. Even dragons respect their boundaries. And the harpies of this preserve weren't even brought here by treaty. The preserve itself was established around their roost. So have you wondered why the captain would send us on a mission to capture not just a harpy, but a matron? This isn't a suicide mission." Creed shrugged. "We've been in situations like this before, and we have never been this prepared. We have the horn, the globes, and the binders. If the captain didn't trust us, he wouldn't have given us the mission, or the horn." "Ah, yes, the unicorn horn," Patton mused. "If not for that horn, I wouldn't have accepted this mission. But it raises another question. Unicorn horns are among the rarest and most precious of magical talismans. What could be so important that the captain is willing to risk a unicorn horn, not to mention two handsome knights?" Creed kept his gaze on the uneven, stony ground as he spoke, slightly surprised that his older partner could keep up so easily. "The captain always says knowledge is our most precious resource. The harpy matron must know something." "Agreed," Patton said, nodding. "But their unique dark language remains a mystery, even to demonic royalty. So while intel seems the most likely reason, it opens even more questions." Creed glanced up, catching Patton's probing gaze. "The situation must be dire." "Dire indeed. But what situation might that be? Does it not bother you that we're risking our lives without knowing the cause?" Creed paused, choosing his words carefully. "We know the cause. The cause is to keep order and protect the magical world. We just don't know the details. But when the captain of the Knights of the Dawn gives an order, it's our duty to obey. We're knights. Intelligence isn't our business." "But is it our business to die?" Patton retorted, raising an eyebrow. "It's not our business. It's our duty," Creed shot back, feeling irritation creeping into his voice. "And if you had more respect for the captain and the rules, we'd both be lieutenants by now. You'd probably even be captain someday." The captain of the Knights of the Dawn, Patton intoned with mock regality, gazing skyward. It does have a nice ring to it. Patton had a knack for using wit to steer a conversation away from argument and back to friendly territory. Creed rolled his eyes. He knew his mentor had no desire to climb the ranks of the knights, but this wasn't the case for him. While Patton seemed fine moving on from the topic, Creed pressed the issue. I'm grateful the captain gave us this mission. He obviously believes in us. It's dangerous, but we're prepared. The second the globes crack, the harpies will be asleep, and we have the horn for backup. That horn will cure us of their venom, Patton said, but it won't protect us from their talons. Creed tilted his head, his confidence unwavering. If it turns into a fight, I have my staff. If it can launch a minotaur like a baseball, it will be more than enough for a harpy. And you're still the best swordsman in the Knights. Creed, Patton said, his tone sharpening. If we can't capture the matron without a fight, we won't capture her at all. We're not going to risk ourselves, or the harpies, so the captain can have his prize. Creed's square jaw tightened. I still don't understand why you're so protective of dark creatures. I agree we shouldn't go around exterminating them. Except for demons, of course, they should all die. But if I'm forced to fight, I'm not going to lose sleep over slaying a monster. Patton ran his hand along a nearby stone fence as they walked. His voice almost reverent as he spoke. I've slain more than my fair share of magical creatures, both light and dark, monsters if you prefer. Each time, I justified it as self-defense or protecting the innocent, but never once was a creature hunting me in my home. I was always in its territory, on some mission of great importance. Patton gestured with his hand, arcing it above high in the air. Yet, here I am again, waltzing uninvited into a harpy's home to capture her in the name of keeping order and protecting the magical world. Creed, I'll say it one last time, if the harpies aren't asleep, we turn back. Creed sighed, frustrated by Patton's stubbornness, but he was unwilling and unable to argue further. Agreed. Hours passed as Patton regaled his partner with stories of past adventures, avoiding any mention of the harpies. Perhaps it was an attempt to let their earlier disagreement fade, or maybe just a way to delay thoughts of the impending danger. Creed sometimes thought Patton exaggerated his tales, but 6 years of serving alongside him had erased any doubt. The stories, as outlandish as they sometimes seemed, were undeniably true, and Patton's reputation as the greatest adventurer in the magical world was well earned. Creed had witnessed it firsthand many times, and despite their differences, he didn't take his partnership with Patton for granted. After traveling several miles up the coastline, they were now seated by a modest campfire, partially concealed by a lone thicket of trees, a welcome reprieve from the otherwise barren landscape. Dinner consisted of roasted rabbit and wild mushrooms. Creed took a bite and spoke through a mouthful of meat. The poor rabbit was looking right at me as the stone left my sling. Didn't move a muscle, just sat there and watched. Must have thought I was too far away to be a threat. Patton nodded as he arranged the mushrooms and rabbit on his skewer. Little guy probably thought it was invisible. Creed sometimes thought his mentor was just rephrasing his words for the sake of hearing himself talk, but he didn't mention it. Instead, he shrugged and replied, Well, lucky for us, I struck it clean with a single stone. Nothing wasted. You're a keen hunter indeed, my young knight, just like your father. He'd be pleased to know that skills he imparted have resulted in such a fine meal. The bright sun that had been beaming through the treetops had given way to a gray overcast, and Creed's mood seemed to shift with the weather. You think he's watching us? My dad, I mean, do you think he can see us? He asked, a note of longing in his voice. Patton's gaze softened as he considered the question. I wish I could say for certain, he replied. But after all I've seen, I'd be a fool to assume otherwise. And if there's ever a time to watch over you, it would be this very evening. His words carried a subtle warning about the danger of their mission. Rather than dwelling on thoughts of his late father, Creed decided to shift the conversation to the mission. The caretaker of empty Crag said there are 11 harpies in the roost. According to his account, they hunt during the middle of the day and the middle of the night, so we're assuming they rest at dusk and dawn. The captain's intel matches, which means the timing should work in our favor. The sun will set in about an hour, giving us roughly 90 minutes to approach the roost with light, scout the cave entrance, confirm there are 11 sleeping harpies, sneak in, break the sleeping globes, identify the matron, bind her, and lead her out. Assuming the globes work as expected, we should have enough time to make our escape. Patton raised an eyebrow. And would you please remind me of the rules of engagement? Creed straightened, reciting confidently. First, we confirm there are no traps or signs of a defensive perimeter. Second, the harpies must be asleep. And third, there must be 11, no more, no less. A sensible plan, Patton replied, nodding. If we confirm all three criteria, we proceed. But never one to miss a teachable moment, he continued. However, you just said one of the most dangerous words in the English language, assume. In situations like this, assuming is a luxury we cannot afford. Our dear captain is correct. Knowledge is indeed our most precious resource. But here we are, left to assume the caretaker's intel is accurate, assume the harpies will be asleep, assume there are only 11, and assume the sleeping globes will work as intended. That's a lot of assumptions to carry into a harpy roost. Creed bristled slightly but responded firmly. We've done everything in our power to prepare. We've collected all possible intel. We have magical potions, a unicorn horn, rare weapons, and mysterious ghostly manacles. Sure, there's risk, but we can't return to the captain empty-handed just because the mission looks too dangerous. Danger is part of the job. It's why the captain chose us. If something goes wrong, we'll improvise. Patton was thoughtful as he stared into the dancing flames of the campfire before turning his gaze towards his young partner. Creed, this mission isn't about impressing the captain. Creed stiffened at the remark. Not entirely, no, but impressing the captain matters, but not for vanity, as you suggest. I happen to believe in the mission of the Knights of the Dawn, just as my father did, and the captain is our leader for a reason and deserves our respect. If I'm to live up to my father's legacy and become a meaningful part of this world, I need to show the captain that I'm willing to make sacrifices and do the hard things others won't. Patton's tone was soft and respectful. I've lived a lifetime of sacrifice and going places others wouldn't. In hindsight, it wasn't always wise. So when your father passed just before you came of age, I was certain you would join the Knights and knew you would be getting yourself into danger. So after keeping the Knights at arm's length my entire life, I decided to join, not for the Knights, but for you, to keep you safe and teach you lessons that your father couldn't. Creed found himself staring into the fire. After a long moment, he drew a deep breath and spoke quietly. I'm sorry I raised my voice. It's just, the Knights were so important to my dad. When I was a kid, he would leave on missions for weeks, and I would cry every time he walked out the door. Creed gave a soft huff. When he came back, I loved hearing his stories about magical creatures and artifacts. But when he talked about balance, preservation, and order, all the things the Knight stood for, I tuned him out. I need to prove to myself that I can be a Knight, that those things matter to me too. Patton could have said many things, but he kept his response simple. Lead on. After breaking camp, they continued their journey northward. The colorful patchwork of farms gradually faded, giving way to the untamed expanse of the Scottish wilderness. All signs of civilization were now far behind them. A fog had rolled in, shrouding the rugged landscape and robbing it of its cheer. The sun's radiance reduced to a soft silver disk, casting an ominous hue over the desolate terrain. To say they were prepared was an understatement. The magical gear they carried between their leather shoulder bags was valuable enough to spark a war in a past age. It wasn't just the unicorn horn. Creed held one of the sleeping globes in his hand. He'd been told the invisible gas inside was potent enough to put an entire stadium to sleep in an instant. While they expected to find the harpies already asleep, this globe would ensure they stayed that way. Among the treasures was an astral shard, sheathed in a cloth to conceal its brilliant white light, a light despised by dark creatures. However, there was one item Creed would gladly have done without: the echo binders. Though the binders unsettled him, the captain had assured them that they were absolutely necessary. He couldn't see them with his eyes, but he could feel their presence, a disquieting weight pressing against his soul. Inscribed with the matron's true name, The ghostly binders wouldn't capture her body. Instead, when the matron's name was spoken aloud, they would fasten to her spirit, seizing her will and forcing her into obedience. They traveled for at least an hour, the fog growing denser with each passing step, constricting their view. But as they pressed forward, a colossal monolith began to take shape. A towering fortress of basalt pillars loomed over the coastline, its true height concealed by the fog, until the uneven spires at the top finally emerged, like spikes atop a dark medieval helmet. Its cave-like entrance yawned wide, forming a gaping mouth, the underside of the basalt pillars resembling unending rows of jagged teeth. Now, the only thing standing between the two knights and the harpies was a slick causeway of black basalt, glistening from the constant drizzle. There were no signs of defenses, only a sinister, unspoken welcome that set Creed's nerves on edge. For a moment they paused, until Patton broke the silence. Making no mention of the view before them, he re-established the criteria for their attack, and Creed assured him that he understood. "Is there anything you'd like to say before you drink the potion?" Patton asked. "The potions will mute any sound our movements make, but won't prevent us from talking. But I submit that once we drink the potion, we should only use hand gestures from here on." "Agreed," Creed replied with confidence. "How long do you think the effects will last?" Patton considered this, tilting his salt and peppered head thoughtfully. "Hard to say. 30 minutes at least, a few hours at most. The same should be true for the potion that counteracts the sleeping globes." Creed gave a hand gesture for "proceed," signaling that they'd now rely on nonverbal communication. Despite the potion rendering all sound mute, Creed and Patton instinctively softened their steps as they approached the mouth of the cave. It began wide but gradually narrowed, the walls pressing closer as they advanced. Soon, the dim silver sunlight would fade entirely. Creed hoped his eyes would adjust, but when the darkness persisted, unease prickled at the edges of his mind. Was the darkness magical? Were they walking into an ambush? At last, Creed's vision adjusted, and out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Patton pointing ahead. Following his mentor's gesture, Creed spotted where the cave should have terminated. Instead, there was an arched opening just large enough for two men to walk through. The sight took Creed's silent breath away. Whatever lay beyond that arch seemed to swallow light completely. The darkness was almost tangible. No, not darkness, blackness. Rather than light pressing naturally into the opening, shadow spilled outward from the cold black archway, pooling unnaturally at their feet. Creed's instincts screamed at him. The intel hadn't mentioned anything about the harpies exuding magical fear, but the icy sensation on the back of his neck made him doubt their mission for the first time. Confirming there were 11 harpies would be impossible without the light of the shard, but neither could they risk waking their winged host. The shard was only to be used if they had no other choice. Focusing on his unease, Creed forced himself to think through the fear. As a child, he had discovered that leaning into pain rather than shying away robbed it of its power. The same method had helped him endure the grief of his father's death. Now, as he dissected the icy terror gripping him, he found something else flowing through his veins, a memory of a promise he had made to himself. And without another thought, he stepped into the shadow.